So I tend to be really bad at these presentations, and therefore recently someone advised me that every time I start a presentation, I should start with an icebreaker. So I just want to get that out of the way first. Oops, is it not working? Damn, see, that's my icebreaker actually. On, yeah. Still not working. Okay, it's fine enough. So that's my icebreaker there. Oh, okay. I'll just do that then. So you spoiled the surprise element there, but I'll try to recover from there. Right. So, how many of you have actually been importing from China? Okay. And how many of you have had issues with your suppliers? Okay. So let me calculate. That's about 87.5%. So, what I've found is when I go to these conferences, I read forums online about importing from China, talking to people, potential clients. There's a common perception that when things go wrong, it's because of the bad intent of the supplier. There's a lot of negativity around importing from China. People think suppliers are out there to get you. And while that might be the case in very few cases, what I've found is, in most cases, the issues are not really due to bad intent, but it's more because of communication gaps. And I'm hoping that I can address some of those gaps today. So just to give you a really quick background, my name is Monga. I've been living in China for the last 7 years, running a sourcing company. Before that, I used to import from China for about 5 years. So been dealing with suppliers in China the last 12 years, making a ton of mistakes. And I'm hoping that I can share some of those mistakes with you so you don't have to, repeat them. And a lot of those mistakes have been around communication and understanding the culture, understanding how the suppliers think. So in terms of the issues with suppliers, I believe you can kind of divide them into 3 broad categories. You've got the ethical issues where, the supplier is genuinely out there to get you. This includes your fraud suppliers, the fly-by-night companies. You have suppliers who intend to change the components to improve their margins. Suppliers who infringe on patents, for example. So that's your unethical suppliers, and I think that represents about 10% of the issues. And what I have learned is that these are the easiest issues to deal with. If you have a good due diligence process in place, you can avoid these issues. I can't think of having an issue in this category for the last 3 to 4 years because now we have a process in place. The next is unrealistic expectation. Now, this tends to be a huge issue with new importers. When a lot of people start thinking about importing from China, they have this expectation that factories in China would be like the factories in the US or UK. They have systems and processes in place. They have technology in place. But when they don't see that, what I have found is most of the factories in China, that I would say about 80 to 90% are small and medium-sized factories. These factories are run by people, who have, in most cases, not been to college. So they're not always systems and process-oriented. They don't always have the tech to keep track of things. What I found is the best tool they have is their memory, which often fails them, which kind of leads to a lot of these QC issues. But what we have to realize is that if they were using these tools, if they had the system and processes in place, if they had managers who went to Harvard and Stanford, then the prices would be a lot higher. Then they lose that competitive advantage of being cheap. So when you're paying 1/10 of the price that you might pay, say, in the US or UK, it's really important to align your expectations and understand the trade-off there, because in most cases, what I found is it takes about 1 to 3 orders for these suppliers to get your product right. So it's really important to have those expectations aligned. And communication issues, this represents about 70 to 80% of the issues. And this includes everything, communicating your requirements, setting your quality standards, setting your timeline, setting up penalties. And this is the stuff that we're going to be talking about mostly today. So why do these relationships matter? Why is it important to have a good relationship with the supplier? It's not something that's just nice on top of the actual business, what we have learned is there's actually a direct return on investment when you invest in your relationships with the suppliers. We have seen people, especially Amazon sellers, they've gone on to have more strategic relationships with suppliers wherein they ran out of the capital, they maxed out their profits, and then they wanted to launch more products, and they gone into these relationships where they're promoting the products by factories. The factory makes the investments, they use their marketing skills, and at least in 2 cases that I'm aware of, they're doing really well. So there's a lot of opportunities, when it comes to growing your business when you invest in these relationships. It also helps, when you have issues with suppliers. Suppliers tend to be a lot more flexible when it comes to reworking goods, dealing with inspection issues when that relationship is in place. And why do these communication issues arise? Now, communication issues are pretty common in any business environment, but when you're dealing with China, they're especially kind of magnified due to the cultural and the language barrier. And language is still a massive barrier. More and more people are speaking English in China, but relative to the rest of the world, it's still a massive issue. Just because a salesperson says, hey, okay, I got your requirements, doesn't actually mean that they have understood what you want. And that's another important cultural point, that yes and okay in China doesn't necessarily mean yes and okay. It's really important to be aware of that. So I just want to talk about some of these most common communication issues that come up and what we have done as a company to deal with those, and hopefully, share some notes on these. And I just want to divide these by your sourcing and manufacturing stages. So you've got your sourcing phase, you've got your production phase, and your post-production phase. So the number one challenge with the sourcing phase is unresponsive factories. Factories not replying to requests for quotes, factories being slow in communication, and it's important to understand why that happens. A lot of people factories in China are really bad with email. They just don't get back to us. And the one reason for that is they get a lot of inquiries, and very few of them are serious ones. Now, there are tons of customer acquisition channels available to factories now. You've got the trade shows, you have your B2B platforms like Global Sources, Alibaba, you have your social media. But all these inquiries coming in, very few of them are actually serious inquiries. I've spoken to some factories where they say they have a less than 1% closure rate, which means 1 out of 100 inquiries actually result in an order. The next issue is the quantity. The quantity in most cases is by far the number one factor when it comes to import from China. So the inquiry not being specific enough. Now, this is a big issue. People send emails like, hey, I want to import 50,000 beanbags from China. I need it urgently in 2 weeks. Send me your best price. And factories get tons of these emails, and they know that there's a 90% chance that this won't lead to an order. I mean, we also use this as a very important qualification criteria for the inquiries we get. If the client, this tells us the client is in a very early stage of the process and is most likely not going to go ahead with an order, so factories just don't bother getting back to them. And then there are other minor factors like lack of perceived investment. Now, someone who's visiting China at a trade show is a lot more invested in the process and likely to place an order than someone who's just sending an email, sitting at their place. And then you've got factors like the company doesn't exist, don't make that product anymore, and then the language barrier. A really interesting thing with the language barrier is a lot of the small and medium-sized factories or workshops, which represent about 30 to 40% of the suppliers in China, they don't actually have someone who speaks English. So they would have that cousin who would come over every 15 days, check the email, let the boss know, hey, you got 2 emails and, this guy wants 20,000 pieces. And he would prepare a reply. The cousin would come back 15 days later and send that reply. And, so that's a factor as well. So what can you do to improve the communication responsiveness of factories? How can we get them to respond faster? The number one thing is drafting detailed product requirements. Now, for a lot of the Amazon sellers, the decision to sell a product is not really based on the love or passion for that product. How many of you are actually really passionate about the product that you sell? Oh, that's a pretty good number. That's about 13.7%. And was that love there before you actually started selling the product, or it developed gradually over time? It was there. That's great. So I think you will do really well. But generally, for most cases, people use an app like Jungle Scout. They do the data analysis. They see that, hey, this product has great potential, low competition, let's sell this, right? And what happens with that is normally the understanding of the product is fairly limited. It's great for sales projections, but not necessarily for quality control. So what can you do to understand the product better? The one strategy that works really well is log on to YouTube, just type in how do you manufacture XYZ, and you can get the production process for most products that you can think of. Another thing that works really well is speaking to traders. So when we start the sourcing process, and if we feel we don't know the product well, the first 2 suppliers we'll speak to would be traders before we send out like 172 emails on Alibaba to suppliers asking for quotes. Now, traders would be a little bit more pricey, but they firstly tend to speak better English, and they tend to be better at responding to inquiries because they focus on the service aspect a bit more than factories would do. Once you understand that product well, once you've had your questions answered, then you send a short and specific email to the factory saying, hey, this is the product I need, these are the specs, get back to me with your best price. And that tends to lead to better response rate. And as a side benefit, it makes the factories think that you know the product, so they actually give you a better price. Otherwise, they just go for a profit maximization strategy, which is, this guy doesn't know the product, add 40%, he's never going to have a repeat order, so I might as well maximize my profit on my first order with the factory. And it also helps with the QC. If you know your product, if you know what's going into it, if you know the parts, the components, it actually helps you draw better quality control checklist, which kind of filters into the quality of your product. The next thing is, keep your language as simple as possible when you're communicating in China. This is very obvious, but people still use a lot of big words which factories don't get, but then they still say, okay, I got it. What I've also found that works really well is using a lot of videos and images when you're talking to suppliers, because that eliminates a lot of the communication gap due to language. And finally, if you find a supplier that you feel is good, you feel that they're responsive, you feel that they have the product that you want, just get on the phone and talk to them. What I found is once you've spoken on the phone to someone, they actually become a lot more responsive on the emails later. Because you kind of, put yourself higher up on their priority ladder after that. So the next challenge in sourcing is how do you negotiate to get the best value? So now I highlight the word best value because the single biggest mistake we find importers make when talking to factories in China is negotiating price too early. And this leads to a lot of issues because firstly, factories would quote low to get your order and then use the worst quality components, and then this leads to all kind of QC issues. It prices out a lot of the better suppliers, which means, because they have standards in place, they probably won't end up quoting because they won't be part of your shortlist. So it's really important not to negotiate on price too early. And then, there's this myth that if you dig deep enough, you will end up finding that factory in the remote northeastern part of China, which makes the best quality product at the lowest price. It's unbelievable how common this scenario is. And I've been into meetings with people who are like, we want the best quality at the lowest price. This is a myth, and there's a very clear trade-off between price and quality. And finally, another thing that you can negotiate on is production time. And a lot of people negotiate really aggressively on this. And this happens because, you did your jungle scout, you found this product, it's got like 200 million sales a month and 0 competitors. And you're really excited, you want to get going. And you contact, I'm exaggerating the numbers a little bit. But, the factory says it's going to take 40 days. You say, hey, I want this in 20. The factory says, okay, no problem. You place the order with that factory. 20 other factories say, no, this is not possible. And you basically, throw them out of the shortlist. Now, the problem with this is that either the factory is going to take shortcuts to meet your production time, which will lead to QC issues, or they're not going to deliver on time anyways, which will damage your relationship with the factory. Because what I found is production times in China for most products and most industries are fairly consistent. There's very little room for negotiation on that. So if a factory reduces the production time by any more than, 5 days, then that's probably a red flag. Now, if you've spoken to 10 suppliers, you know what the industry standard production time is for that product. So it's something that I don't really advise negotiating on too much. So how do you negotiate? The first thing is knowing your end goal. For us, the end goal is, getting the best value, which we define as the best combination of price for a defined quality standard. Now, this end goal can change. Your end goal could be to find the cheapest product, and that works in certain markets and for certain industries. But for Amazon sellers, I don't think that's a good idea at all, because it will reflect in your reviews, and for consumer products that can actually come and bite you. So there's nothing wrong in looking for the lowest price, but it's very important to know what your end goal is and what the trade-off is there. Your end goal could be to find the best possible quality in the market, and then, you don't look at price as a factor at all. The second thing is define your quality standards. Now, if you went to YouTube and did that research, you would already have defined your quality standards really well. You've done your product research, you know exactly, the product, the specs of the product, how it's made. So you've already defined the quality standard up front. Once you've done that, you go to suppliers and say, hey, this is my quality standard, these are the specs I want, what's the best price you can offer. Another factor we look at is the responsiveness of the supplier. Are they able to answer technical questions? Are they quick in responding? And based on that, we normally select our 3 to 4 suppliers. And finally, we would negotiate on price and payment terms at this stage. This is the best time to negotiate. The next thing is, when you're doing the price negotiation, there is a trade-off between urgency and the best price. So if you send an email to the supplier saying, hey, what happened to my discount? Do you want to go ahead or not every single day? Chances are they won't budge, because I've found Chinese suppliers, and Chinese culture in general is really patient culture. So if you want to outcompete them in patience, you better be meditating like every single day. So it's really important to be patient there and kind of be aware of that trade-off there. And finally, you build a relationship and then renegotiate after 3 orders. We find that after 3 orders, a window kind of opens up to renegotiate price, because you've shown to them that you're a repeat buyer, you're trustworthy, you've shown your faith in the supplier, and they're kind of more flexible at that stage. So this is kind of emails that suppliers get all the time. I'm looking to import finger monkeys from China. Our first order would be a trial order of 50, and then we would be ordering 500,000 monkeys annually. Please give us your lowest price for 500,000 units. The supplier reads the email, and then their response is this. It just doesn't work. Suppliers, there's a lot of courses out there that tell you to talk about projections, and, we're going to do large orders. We're very close to being, getting into Walmart and stuff. But the fact is, Chinese suppliers are completely immune to projections. They only care about historical data and the quantity of the first order that you'll place to them. Everything else is inconsequential. What you're going to do in the future can only be established if you have a track record. If you place 3 orders with them, shown them that you keep coming back, you have the ability to sell the product, they tend to be a lot more responsive. Right, getting into the production phase. So one of the most common challenges in production is delays in production. Because normally what would happen is you would place your order, and then the factory says it's going to take 20 days, so you go out for 20 days, go on a holiday to Spain, or do your thing. Then you come back after 20 days, send them an email saying, hey, are my goods ready? And then they say, there's a delay in production. So the important thing here is not to take a wait and watch approach. It's very important to kind of, keep asking the factory, hey, what's happening with my order? Is it on time? You have to have a very tight follow-up process in place. And another thing you can do here is you can request pictures at various stages of the process. Once the factory receives the goods, once the package arrives, and this kind of not only keeps the factory under pressure to deliver on time, it actually helps you eliminate a lot of the QC issues. Before we actually physically send someone for an inspection, we always ask the factory to send us the pictures. And we find a lot of issues with packaging especially. There's something wrong with the printing, something wrong with the colors. We can detect that, we get the factory to fix that before we actually have to invest in an inspection. So there's a side benefit to that. So the next thing you should always have penalties for late shipment. And this is a common question that I see on the forums and stuff. How much should it be? Should you really enforce it? What we do is we have penalties in our contracts, but we normally don't enforce it unless the delay is significant, and especially for the first couple of orders, if there's a delay of 4 to 5 days, we find that enforcing a penalty really damages the relationship. But we would give them a warning and remind them about the clause. If they continue to do that, then we would definitely enforce it. And by the time you're on your 3rd order, the factory is more likely to accept that clause because, again, you've shown to them that you're a repeat buyer, and now it's the time to kind of send them a stronger message about the delays. Finally, don't underestimate the power of the salesperson. Your point of contact at the factory could be the account manager or the salesperson. They can be quite influential in a lot of the cases. In a lot of the cases, they are the relative of the boss in small factories. In your slightly bigger factories, if it's someone who's been working in the factory for a while, they again have a lot of influence. So what happens is, like, during busy times, like before the Chinese New Year or before Christmas, factory would always prioritize the biggest customer to go on the production line first. But then if you have two customers who have a similar sized order, it's the influence of the salesperson that dictates who will go on the production line first. And we have been able to use a relationship with the salespeople on a couple of occasions where we placed the order later. The salesperson said, hey, we cannot deliver on time. But somehow you were able to convince them to actually step on the factory floor, negotiate for us, and get our goods delivered before the other clients. Finally, the most common issue happens in the post-production phase, which is an inspection fail. So you're happy with the price, the samples are approved, you place your order with the factory, and you're excited about launching your product on Amazon, you have your listing ready, and then all of a sudden you get this report from your inspector saying, hey, the inspection has failed. And that's like one of the worst things that you could experience in the process. But why does this happen? This normally happens because for most people, the only QC they do is a pre-shipment inspection. A pre-shipment inspection is great to detect issues while your goods are in China. It doesn't help you avoid issues in any way, because by the time it's already too late. So it's really important, again, if you want to avoid issues, you have a due diligence process in place. What I believe works best in avoiding issues is the due diligence bit, knowing your factory, knowing the capabilities, getting them to, it doesn't matter how much hurry you're in, you have to get an approved sample and approve it. You have to make sure that the factory can make that product. Just because they have a picture on their global sources account doesn't actually mean they can make that product. Most factories, they manufacture like 2 products, but they'll put up pictures of like 50 other products that they found at trade shows or in the market, and they believe that if they get an order, they can make that product. So normally what we found here is the first 3 orders are really critical. It normally takes about 3 orders for a factory in China, in my opinion, to align their processes and systems to create a perfect product. Now, it doesn't mean that you lower your standards and you don't expect a perfect product, but it just means that when it comes to minor defects, you might need to be aware that, the definition of what's a perfect product varies from client to client. The factory has to align its systems and processes so that, they align to the client's definition, and that can take a while. And then there is what we call the challenge of quality fade. So quality fade is the quality of the product going down over time because of supplier changing components, changing their sub-suppliers and stuff. And this is a common issue in China. If you Google this, you can get a lot more info on this. So finally, how many of you have heard the term Guan XI? Right, that's really good. So Guan XI is a very deep and important concept in the Chinese culture. In its very simplest form, it refers to the relationships you have and the exchange or reciprocal exchange of favors to build that relationship. Now, this is really important in China because this influences your negotiating power to a very large extent. And like I mentioned, there is a real ROI on building these relationships because the cost of switching suppliers in a physical product business is really high. When you switch suppliers, it can lead to short-term disruptions, short-term quality issues, and in the world of Amazon, having a stock out for a couple of months often means you lose your BSR, you have new competitors that take your market share, and you basically have to start from scratch.
It's on.
So let's look at a couple of things you can do to build relationships with supplier. Number one is focusing on scale. Like I mentioned earlier, there's nothing more important in China than the size of the order and the reputation of the order. For factories, repeat orders are the lifeblood of the factory. They want to make sure that this client is going to be successful and will be coming back to us again and again because that pays the bills for the factory. So, sometimes this is more of a, strategic decision in your marketing. If you have $50,000 to invest, do you invest $10,000 in 5 products or do you invest 50 in one? And there's a lot of other factors other than sourcing, but from a sourcing and QC point of view, it definitely pays to have scale. The next thing is pay on time. So with the smaller and medium-sized factories, they really do work on tight margins. I know factories that work on like 8 to 12% margins, and their cash flow can often be tight. So if you pay on time, it just kind of helps, maintain that relationship. Finally, red bags. Make sure you send a little red bag with some Chinese yuan in it to your salesperson, because this is not unethical at all. In China, this is normal and accepted, and it's just something that makes them work harder for you because they're the person on the ground. There's internal negotiations between salespeople in terms of what happens in the factory, and this kind of gives you a little edge there. And finally, meet the management. In most cases, the factory owners or bosses might not speak English, but still just showing your face and having a point of contact makes a difference, when issues happen. Because sometimes the salesperson has a vested interest in not resolving the issue. And this happens because salesperson, major form of salary is the commissions. So sometimes you have to rework the goods, they lose those commissions because there is no profit. Whereas the owners might have a longer-term perspective, they might be more willing to rework the goods because they want to retain the customer. And finally, good cop, bad cop. What this means is you have your sourcing company in China, your inspection company, whoever is representing you in China, be the bad cop, enforce the strict standards, negotiate on price, and then you look really nice and you just work on the relationship side. So to wrap it up, what I've found is the most important thing when it comes to building these relationships is empathy. Really trying harder to put yourself in the factory's shoes, understanding what their challenges are. At the end of the day, the salesperson on the other end is a human being trying to make a living, serving you to the best of their ability. And sometimes just understanding their point of view helps resolve a lot of these issues. So that's pretty much all I have to say. Global Sources was kind enough to give me 2 minutes to talk about what we do. So IMEX Sourcing, like I mentioned, we are a sourcing and QC company. We specialize in working only with e-commerce sellers. And we found that sourcing was always a very traditional industry. And we're trying to change that to an extent by having a more tech-savvy approach, which is why we recently launched what we call the 360 portal, which is a dashboard-based system which allows you to manage your project, sourcing, and automate a lot of the stuff. And if you want to know a bit more, there's actually a book in your welcome pack where you can read a bit more about us. Or we also have a booth at the show. The booth number is L36 in Hall 11, e-commerce pavilion. So feel free to come down and visit us. And finally, if you're at the Global Sources show for a while, you might find this ebook useful that I wrote a while ago in terms of how you can make the most of your time at the show. And that's pretty much it. That's my contact info. Feel free to email me, connect with me on Facebook, send me your questions. I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Any questions?
Thank you for the presentation. Very, very helpful. I did have a question about one of the things you said at the end about red bags. I've heard mixed comments and feedback on whether or not you should still do that. What is your opinion and what has been your experience with that?
My opinion is that, it's not required. But when it comes to those situations where you want the salesperson to be working till 11 o'clock to resolve your problem, that's what makes the difference. Like in our company, for example, normally it's not normal, but then clients proactively do this, and the policy that we have is they have to report it to the management. But in terms of factories, again, we have found it does work under specific situations. It's not a necessity, but it's basically equivalent to giving a gift. But because a lot of these people are not earning a lot, the cash equivalent of a gift is more important to them.
How much would you give in terms of the amount, or is there any gift that people that Chinese sourcing agents love that's from the US or from Europe that you could give that's not money?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. If you bring gifts from the US and stuff, sometimes people really like it, because in China, people still really like imported stuff, because they think it's cool and better. But yeah, in terms of how much to give, it also depends on the size of your orders and stuff, but I normally find 500 RMB as a minimum is a good amount.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. So how about actually sending gifts to the factory after a successful run of a product?
Yeah, I would send it, to the salesperson especially. I would normally align sending of a gift to, yeah, that's a good point. Actually, you can align it to results. So if you've had a good run, you can actually send it over and say, hey, thank you, you did a great job, and I hope we can maintain these standards in future orders as well.
What's, I guess, my follow-up question, this is really hot. What is too much? It's good. It's a fair question because, you don't want to set too high of an expectation for them to expect something every single time. You don't.
Absolutely. That's why
Yeah.
I personally believe that it's better to only give these out during, say the Chinese New Year is the most important time, or an occasion like it's their birthday. Because if you give it out on every single order, then you are setting an expectation that every time they do well, they get something, which is not an expectation you want to set.
Okay.
Any more questions for Ash? No, there's one more there.
Can you send it via PayPal?
You can. It is actually, a lot of the Chinese people are starting to use PayPal, but they prefer WeChat. WeChat has a really cool function called, I think it's called Red Bag or something, which is designed specifically for this purpose, because the exchange of, in fact, it was the Red Bags that changed WeChat's fortunes when it comes to the payments market, because it's such an integral part of the culture. Yeah, and if you get funds from a person in China sent to your WeChat, irrespective of where you are, you can still do the transfer. Because we've actually had, I've had a couple of friends in the US saying, hey, can you transfer me 500 to my WeChat so I can send it back to my factory? And with the limit that works, I think the limit is 2,000 RMB or something.
And for gifts, are there some colors that are preferred more, like red, and some colors that are
absolutely.
taboo?
Red is the color in China, It's considered lucky, and it's also the color of the ruling elite in China, so red, yeah.
And some products are taboo as gifts, like clocks, I think, right?
Yeah, clocks is not considered good in China because it kind of sends the message that your time is limited.
Okay, any more questions for Ash? No? Okay, thank you very much, Ash.
Great, thank you very much.